every organization has the rules that will be in the HR handbook that you receive in your first week of working
Hmm.
there. But then they have those unspoken rules, those other opportunities for advancement, opportunities to socialize, those rules that are only usually told through mentors or proximity to leadership and power. And many people in organizations are left to figure out those rules on their own. And it does have an impact on not only their performance, but their long-term career trajectory.
What if the biggest barrier to inclusion at work isn't what's said out loud? It's all the things that aren't. Welcome to Work Better, the Steelcase podcast where we talk with experts about how to help the world work better. I'm your host, Chris Congdon, and today's conversation might make you rethink some of the rules you didn't even know you were playing by. My guest today is Dr. Ella Washington. She's an organizational psychologist and author of the book Unspoken, a guide to cracking the hidden corporate code. And today she's calling out something that many of us have felt but couldn't quite name. It's the if you know, or IKYK culture. It's the meeting after the meeting, the opportunities that never get announced. Dr. Ella helps us understand why some people's careers seem to move smoothly upward, while others get stuck trying to figure out the rules to get ahead. But she also helps us understand how leaders can help level this playing field. Her book was inspired by a personal moment of clarity, so that's where we start the conversation. Here's Dr. Ella. Welcome to Work Better, Dr. Ella.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
I'm excited to hear from you as well. And I want to start out talking about something that a lot of us have experienced in our careers, but maybe not in the same way that you experienced it. We all kind of have these, I'll call them moments of clarity, where something happens in our lives that really causes us to think seriously about the direction we're going in. Could you tell us the story that was kind of your moment?
Yeah, absolutely. It still kind of gives me chills when I think back to it. About 9 years ago, I had just been promoted in a new consulting role, and I had so many clients, and I knew that the stakes were high for me to do well, as many of us want to
Mhm.
do well when you're first promoted, right? To demonstrate that, they made the right decision. And so um, I remember I was driving back, and this was the middle of the day, so about probably around 2 p.m., from a client site about an hour away from my home. And all of a sudden, I woke up on the side of the road.
Oh my gosh.
And what had happened was that I had fallen asleep at the wheel.
Oh
And
no.
I recognized what had happened when someone pulled right beside me, and it was a good Samaritan on the road. So thankfully, they checked I was okay, and they were like, okay, you probably want to get going. So the police don't think anything was like seriously wrong. But it was such a scary moment.
Yeah.
And so many things went right in that moment. There was an angel there to check on me, but also if there had been median in that on that highway as opposed to some dirt area in the middle, it would have ended up very
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah. Right.
And that was my wake up call. That not only was I burnt out, that something was wrong. Something was really wrong with
Hmm.
how I was approaching work. And even in that situation, I think many of us, have found ourselves in situations that may have been similar. But what I am so not proud of from that moment was the fact that I didn't tell anyone. I think that is the
Mm.
real travesty in this story. It's not just the act of falling asleep because I was so burnt out, but it was that I didn't feel safe enough to tell my manager at the time. I didn't even feel safe enough to tell my loved ones because I was a bit embarrassed, that this had happened to
Yeah.
me in the middle of the day, right? And so,
Right.
um, to me, not only was it a wake up sign, it's a warning signal because we have community for a reason and our workplaces should be safe enough, at least for us to tell our manager, our colleagues, what's really going on with us, especially when it comes to something so serious.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we're in a culture right now where putting on this facade, our best foot forward, has just been ingrained in our behaviors. If you think about what you post on social media, I mean, we all know that we're
Ooh,
not going to post,
yeah.
like, wow, I had a really crummy day at work and I'm feeling burned out and exhausted. We're always going to paint this beautiful picture. And I think like sometimes we almost come to believe that, well, that's the truth for everybody else. Everybody else
Right.
has this perfect career and it's going great. I'm the only one who's dealing with this. Um, Dr. Ellie, you talk in your work about kind of these unspoken rules. I think that's an example of one, like don't talk about it if you're struggling. And in your studies about how workplaces actually work, what's one of the truths that you think leaders need to hear right now?
You know, I want leaders to understand that your workplace is probably running on some unspoken rules that you can't see, but your people feel every single day.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk to leaders, I feel they tend to overestimate how much success comes from just talent and performance and hard work. And they often forget about those informal and invisible norms that they likely had to navigate to get where they are.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is when you get in that seat of leadership, and research actually shows, once you get higher up in leadership, you forget what it's like. It's really hard for you to empathize and even remember what it's like in those earlier phases of your career. And so, um, every organization has the rules that will be an HR handbook that you receive in your first week of
Mm-hmm.
working there. But then they have those unspoken rules, those other opportunities for advancement, opportunities to socialize, those rules that are only usually told through mentors or proximity to leadership and power. Um, and many people in organizations are left to figure out those rules on their own. And it does have an impact on not only their performance, but their long term career trajectory.
Well, and I feel like as leaders, sometimes, if we've been around an organization longer, there are things that we know or we believe to be true, but we don't always think about, transferring that knowledge to everybody in the organization because it's just kind of second nature. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about a phrase that you use that if you know culture. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. So on social media, you may see it as IYKY.
Okay.
Let me do that again. On social media, you may see it as IYKYK, right? If you know, you know.
Okay.
And when you hear that phrase, most people automatically can resonate with the fact that, like, there are some people in the in crowd of this information. And
Yeah.
if you know, great. But if you don't know, the implication is that no one may tell you, or I may not tell you if I'm saying if you know, you know. And so, um, in real life, that happens all the time. I might say, well, I know the best new restaurant in Washington, D.C., where I live, right? And if you know, you know, right? So it's like I'm keeping the best kept secret for myself. But when those cultures show up in the workplace, that's where it becomes problematic because it's no longer something that would be nice to know. Oftentimes, it can lead to derailments of folks' careers or lack of opportunity to advance if they don't know the rules of operations, if they don't know how things actually get done. And so, what you said before around, you know, oftentimes leaders get used to how things are done and they kind of forget that someone either told them or they may have learned the hard way. It's that passing of knowledge that's critical, but it's also the acknowledgement that there are some informal expectations in this work environment that do matter. Like whether it's, we expect you to come to the happy hours at least once a quarter to, say hello to everyone. And so folks know who you are. Or we do expect you to dress in a certain particular way, even if you're working from home, right? There's so many things that organizations come to have as their norms, but they often don't name. And then that leaves people guessing.
Do you feel like when you got to that level of just crazy exhaustion where you're falling asleep in the middle of the day, on the road, was that part of an unspoken rule that you were feeling at the time? Were you feeling like I just have to drive myself further and harder to where you got to that place?
work environment that I was in, it was all about how many hours that you were logging on your client work. It was all about, meeting the annual goals for the organization. And then you had individual goals that you needed to meet. And so um, there wasn't really an option or space to say, hey, this is too much. And I didn't want to be honest, because I wanted to demonstrate that I was up for the challenge. And what I conflated was, working harder and more with my ability to do the job, right? And those things aren't the same. I had the ability and the competence and the skills to do the job, but that didn't mean that I had the capacity to take on 10 clients at one time, right? And to be able to give my all. And so absolutely, I think, that unspoken rule of not complaining or not talking about your boundaries or your limitations, or just even the season that you're in right now. Maybe last year I could do 10 clients, but this year, for whatever life reason, health reason, personal reason, I'm not able to do that, or I don't desire to do that. I think that's the conversation we have to normalize.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a time earlier in my life. When we're recording this podcast for our listeners, it's tax week. We just passed April 15th. And I'm remembering when my husband was early in his accounting days, the pressure to achieve a certain amount of billable hours was just really high. But I don't know that that was a clearly articulated rule. You just knew that the people who were getting ahead were the ones who were putting in, I'd say, kind of inhumane amounts of hours just to be able to get through. So are there other examples of like in that situation, we've talked a little bit about people who are maybe newer in their career, not getting the unspoken rules. Are there other kind of situations of like in groups, out groups that, we need to make sure that we're communicating clearly to?
Yeah. So, one thing that comes to mind when you mentioned the experience your husband had early in his career was, thinking about what are the types of cultures that we celebrate or that we acknowledge in our workplaces, right? And this would never be in the rule book, but I remember in my first consulting job, it used to be a badge of honor if we came in and said, oh, we did an all-nighter last night. We were up all night till 6 a.m. working on the deck. And that was just like a thing. And no one would actually feel bad for you. It was just like, oh, yeah, well, that's what you got to do. That should not be normalized, right? That is a cultural thing. And then that becomes an unspoken rule that, like, not only it is appropriate for me to be working throughout the night on a regular basis on these client deliverables, but it is okay for me to talk about it and brag about it, if you will. And a manager kind of stopped me in my tracks in my very next position at a different consulting firm. And I think I alluded to kind of working all night on something. And she was very clear. She said, well, here, we don't want you to work all night. The expectation is not that you're pulling all-nighters. And if you're doing that on a regular basis, we're going to kind of question if you're having challenges with time management. And we're going to see where we need to support you or shift some things, because that's not what we want to see in this culture. I vividly remember that conversation in that moment, because that was night and day difference culturally. All the rules on paper at both organizations were the exact same. Get your work done, and do what you need to do to be in client service. But the posture of the culture of the second firm I was at was vastly different. And it made a huge impact on my well-being and experience at that organization.
So I think we can safely say most leaders would not want their people, they might celebrate you pulling an all-nighter, but they really don't want you to fall asleep at the wheel. That's pretty, So what guidance would you give to leaders who are listening today about how do you bring these kind of unspoken rules to light? And how do you change them too, if you need to?
Yeah. Well, you can't change things that you don't acknowledge, right? And so first we have to understand that these unspoken rules exist. And when leaders talk to me and they say, well, how do I figure this out? One, you have to talk to your employees. You have to talk to your team members to understand their experience. Because as I said before, oftentimes we're in positions of leadership and we have forgotten what it's like to be in those earlier seats, or things have changed, right? We are quick as leaders to say, oh, back in my day, or when I first started working X and Y. However, we don't equally acknowledge the fact that things are different for those folks early in their careers. And so you have to really start to understand what is their lived work experience. I think when you have new employees, it's the easiest way to do that. Check in with them in the first 30 days, 60 days, and ask them, what observations have they made? What questions are coming up for them? What do they observe the culture to be? Now, in order to get some real answers to those questions, there has to be psychological safety and trust, right? But oftentimes I find that leaders are not curious enough about the lived experience of their team members in order to address some of these cultural unspoken norms. Because again, we assume everything is good because the rules that we have on paper. And the second thing I might say is that, leaders have to stop assuming people will just figure it out.
Yeah.
We are leaders for a reason. We are supposed to lead our teams. And so when you use broad terms like executive presence or cultural fit without defining them, it's not a neutral experience. You are gatekeeping. It's helpful to define what you actually mean. When you say cultural fit, what does that mean here at this organization? What are the behaviors and the competencies that you're expecting to see? When you say executive presence and what you're looking for someone to get promoted to that next level, be specific. Is it in how you communicate verbally, non-verbally, asynchronously, or what have you with clients or with team members? Is it that you show up when we ask you to, whether it's a client meeting or a social gathering? Whatever those things are, you have to name them. And just leaving them up for interpretation doesn't make you more accessible. It doesn't make you, a leader that people look up to. It makes your team members confused and not really understanding how to navigate the workplace environment.
Yeah, that is just such good insight and advice for all of us. I also want to ask about when we were talking about change a moment ago, it feels like in the past 5-6 years, since the pandemic, we have gone through more change at work than we have in like generations. And one of the big changes we see with a lot of our customers is remote or hybrid work that, companies now are kind of all over the place. It feels like there's some who leaned into it and then they're really backing off of it. There's others who say, hey, we never really leaned into it in the first place. We never left the office. We don't have to worry about bringing people back, et cetera. But today I feel like we're in this world where, some people are in the office having experiences and others aren't to varying degrees. And I'm really interested in how to navigate these unspoken rules kind of with that scenario going on. Do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. So, remote work did not eliminate unspoken rules. It actually, in some ways, made them harder to see. One thing that, we studied early during the pandemic was something called proximity bias. And it's the tendency to favor people who are physically closest to you. And that often leads to more opportunities, visibility, sponsorship, simply because they're seen more often. And so this is not always intentional, but it is consistent. And what's interesting is, proximity bias didn't just start when we shifted to a more remote and hybrid work experience. It's always been there. We've always heard leaders talk about they want people to be visible. They want people to have that face time in the office or with other individuals in the organization. And so, one, it's us naming what our expectations are and making it plain. And it cannot be assumptions. So I remember a few years ago, one company got a lot of backlash for publicly stating that their remote employees would not be promoted if they were not in the office, right? So they really drew a hard line in the sand, and they got a lot of backlash because that was not the right approach. I want to be clear. But what I did actually appreciate is that they were honest and transparent and letting their team members know their expectations and who or what types of competencies they were looking for to get promoted, which in that case was FaceTime, being able to be in person. Yeah. Now, what they got wrong is that if they're going to have remote and hybrid workers, they can't punish them for that's their worker status, right? They have to acknowledge that this proximity bias exists and make it a pathway that everyone can succeed, no matter if they're remote or hybrid, workers. But again, what I'd appreciate is they made it plain. But there's some other ways that, this shows up in our remote and hybrid work environments. Even when you think about, who speaks up first in a Zoom meeting, right? We used to say in the office, the loudest person, the first person to speak is often the one who gets paid attention to. And that is even more prevalent in these virtual room meetings, because as we know, there's a little lag time, right? And so it's easy
Right.
to, not get your word in, or it can be hard to jump into a conversation, or even signals like who talks the most in the Slack chat or whatever your company uses, right?
Right.
Those types of things are now looked at as, engagement, is looked at as, the employee being present. And if someone doesn't name those things, then again, someone may easily think, well, I was on the meeting and they said we didn't have to have our cameras on. And so I thought it was fine. When really someone is, judging you, or making a mental note, or making even worse assumptions about why you're not on camera, that you're not engaged,
Mm-hmm.
instead of just saying, hey, we expect everyone to be on camera in our team meetings, and
Yeah.
making that expectation clear, as opposed to the assumptions that happen and then all of the downstream effects from not making those things plain.
I had really good advice from a leader one time because, we worked in a hybrid way before hybrid was even a term. Like that was just a behavior here. But one of my leaders coached me to say, you need to make your presence felt.
Mm.
However you're working, make sure your presence is felt. And then she went on to explain like what that meant, because I could see where that might be an example of kind of vague direction. But I thought that was really helpful. So many of our listeners are thinking about the physical space as well as the virtual space, like how those two are working together. And I know that you're not a designer by trade, but I am always interested in how you think about the role of the workplace, the role of space. And I'm curious if you have things that you would suggest to all of us about how do we create, these kind of more equitable experiences at work that are going to help everybody thrive.
Yeah, one thing that I think about when it comes to space is creating space for real connection and conversation, and one-on-one moments. I've seen a lot of workplace environments where, we're moving to these open space concepts, and that is, designed to drive team orientation and also the flexibility for folks to come in and hotel at different spaces. And that's great. But what often is missing is that ability to, have that time with your manager to let them know that something is not
Mm-hmm.
going quite right in a safe space environment. And so I think about that both in the physical and just the cultural. Like, how do we make sure that we're making time and space for those authentic connections? If you only talk to your manager when there's a 30-minute meeting on the calendar every other week, and that's the only time that you have, that doesn't really often feel like a safe space to say, hey, something's not
Yeah.
going quite right, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't actually create the space for the human connection that we actually need in these relationships to have trust. And so, yes, there's time for those quick meetings and going down the checklist. I mean, we all have them and they're needed to keep things moving forward. But then as a leader, you also have to think about, how do I intentionally create spaces to check in with this person, just to make sure things are
Mm-hmm.
going okay, or to ask different questions. If I'm not really getting what I'm needing and I think that there's something else that could be going on, how do I create space to even ask the right questions to connect with my team members?
We're going through a time now, I think, but we all go through times where the situation in the world maybe looks a little challenging. The situation at work feels tough. And I'm just curious, like, what's giving you hope right now about the future of work and how things are likely to change going forward?
You know, the younger generations, while I know we read all the headlines, they also give me hope, right? Because they see things in a new perspective. And when we take the time to create space for them to learn from us and for us to learn from them, you can't help but to get this positive feeling the future is bright. I mean, they have so many great ideas. They're living in a world that we could have only imagined, with technology being something they've had from the very beginning, right? We're still adapting in some ways. And they kind of haven't figured out in that regard. Now, they still need our guidance and support, but I think it's really powerful when you have those intergenerational conversations about how we can actually make the workplace better, because you get all these new innovative ideas. The other thing that really is inspiring me as of late is I'm starting to see more organizations recognize that with the push of AI, it's really helpful to get more things done, but it doesn't work without the human part of leadership, without that human connection.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm actually getting really, really excited about that, because I think this is an opportunity for leaders to lean in even further to those human skills, to those areas of who they are, from their personality to just the people skills that they actually have developed over the years, to help teams figure out what to do with all of these changes, with all of that, what AI is bringing to the workplace that can be really positive. So I'm excited about that, because I think management and leadership skills have never been more important. And I love that many companies are not only starting to recognize it, but investing in those skills to make sure they're not falling behind.
Oh, I agree with you on that one so much, that it does give me hope when I hear organizations say that, yes, AI it's a productivity tool without a doubt. Let's leverage it and learn how to use it. And let's recognize that it's impossible to truly innovate without human hearts and minds being able to fully function at work. Dr. Ella, this has been such a great conversation. I've really appreciated learning from you. And I just want to tell you to be safe when you're out on the road, and I'm sure you are.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
People who feel a sense of community at work are more likely to be highly engaged, more productive, and report greater well-being. Now, a new issue of Work Better magazine shares how to create communities at work so people can thrive. Find design, insights, and solutions for the ways people work today in the new issue of Work Better magazine. Get your free copy at steelcase.com/WB magazine.
Since talking with Dr. Ella, I've been thinking about the unspoken rules in my organization, and could I name those, especially for newer employees? If you enjoyed today's episode, would you share it with a friend or colleague, and follow us wherever you get your podcasts? Please be sure to visit us at steelcase.com/research to sign up for the Work Better weekly newsletter for workplace research and design ideas delivered right to your inbox. Thanks again for being here, and we hope your day at work tomorrow is just a little bit better. Thank you to everyone who helps us work better, including our producers, Katie Pace, Rebecca Charbowski, Stav Kontas, Chiara Licari, and Brandon Lacic. We are thankful for the creative art direction by Erin Ellison and Emily Cowdery, and for the editing and sound mixing by Soundpost Studios, and the technical support by Mark Caswell, Sean McManaman, and Jose Jimenez. Our digital publishing is by Areli Arellano and Jordan Marks.